Welcome to the many faces of fantasy, of which we have 3 today.
Soon to be 4.
Soon to be 4. I'm Nick Mamatas. I'm an author and editor. My main editorial work is Japanese fantasy and science fiction in translation for Viz Media, a local publishing/media company. And I'm also a novelist. And we have 3 other panelists here who are going to introduce themselves briefly. And then I'm going to ask them about the faces of fantasy.
Hi there, guys. My name is Victoria. I sometimes go by V.E. Schwab, and I am an author of fantasy. I mostly write about the lines between things, between life and death, and good and evil, and hero and villain. And most recently, I'm the author of the Shades of Magic trilogy, which started with A Darker Shade of Magic, and then A Gathering of Shadows, and soon A Conjuring of Light. And it's about a magician who moves between alternate versions of London.
I'm Marie Brennan, most recently the author of the Memoirs of Lady Trent, which are a sort of quasi-historical fiction series about a lady adventurer and dragon naturalist traveling around the world to study dragons, which in her setting are not, Smaug and, magical kind of immortal creatures, but rather natural animals with all kinds of fascinating behaviors, and kind of getting into pulp adventure problems along the way. I've also written historical fiction, secondary world fantasy, or historical fantasy, I should say. And I think we'll be getting into some of the differences between those things in a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Richard Kadrey, and I write the Sandman Slim, urban fantasy, noir fantasy, whoever is marketing the damn books that day, fantasy. The new Sandman Slim's coming out in June, The Perdition Score, and I've started a new series that just came out about a month ago called The Everything Box, about a magic thief named Coop who isn't as competent as he thinks he is. So.
Well, the first question that comes to mind is the question my father asked me when my first book came out, which was, what's wrong with you? Richard?
I like the idea of sitting in a room typing for the rest of my life.
Do you want it alphabetically, chronologically?
Most important first.
Yeah. I have joked many a time, and I think there is some truth to this, that writers are kind of professional sadists because we do, in fact, train our brains to think of all kinds of ideas, including horrible ones, and we reward them for doing this. And after a while, you get to a point where you're in the middle of a book and you wake up in the mornings, yawn, stretch, and the first clear thought in your head is vivisection. And it was an idea for the book I was working on, and it fit, but that's what I've turned my brain into, the kind of thing that wakes me up in the morning with vivisection.
I grew up wanting things to be stranger than they were. I was that kid that looked around every corner and behind the curtains and through the doors and thought, wouldn't it be cool if I saw something else instead of what I expected to see? And so I've grown up into a writer that writes things stranger than they are. And there's a reason that most of my books take place in a world that looks much like ours, wherein magic or darkness or a world of the dead, all of these things are just out of reach in a way that is like maybe they're there and you just haven't quite found the way to find them. That's who I've always been as long as I can remember, and so that's just who I've become as a writer.
Yeah, I know as a kid I read any number of books that weren't actually fantasy, but tell that to 7-year-old me. Some of them I go back and revisit, like Zilpha Keatley Snyder's The Egypt Game.
Yes.
I will say The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett was my favorite book for a while growing up, and everything vaguely magical in that book I just took at face value whole hog plus a bit more and read that book as fantasy. And then The Egypt Game, it's about these children who basically make up their own version of the ancient Egyptian religion, and I reread it a couple of years ago and went, wow, there is actually zero fantasy in here. That is not how I remember this book at all. So yeah, I would take any hint of something otherworldly, anything mystical, anything beyond what my daily life was, and just crank that up to 11.
So here's my question. Only child? Only child?
No.
Anyone?
No, only child.
Only child,
Yeah.
yeah. We are only child. You are the tiny god of your own world to
Yes.
start with. As a writer, you are the tiny god of your own world. There's, I think, a direct correlation.
But I also really understood what you were saying when, like, you as a kid, you wanted the world to be more interesting. I grew up in New York when I was young, and at a young age, I saw a lot of modern art and seeing. I remember this very clearly. My first Dali painting, and then Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. Like ever since then, I those are sort of my touchstones in trying to understand the world. That made a lot of sense to me, and the rest of the world was kind of drab in comparison.
Exactly.
I would say it's not even so much that I wanted the world to be stranger than it seemed to be, as I just kind of didn't make all those distinctions yet, in sort of the ways that kids don't, right? You're not quite as set in your view of what is and is not possible when you're a child.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with me.
Shall we?
Anyway,
listen?
so we have this idea of childhood coming up, and this is a common refrain with when you ask someone who's a fantasist or a science fiction writer, then they say, well, why are you writing fantasy? Oh, when I was a kid, I read fantasy, which is universally true. Every kid's read fantasy, but not every writer ends up being a fantasist. So was there a moment when you came back to fantasy after going away to read literary fiction or to be a professional in some field? Or were you hardcore, like fantasy was it, and I made my decision at 7, this is going to be me? We'll start with you because we'll go back and forth like that.
Okay. No, actually, I grew up. I loved reading, but I read thrillers. I read Robert Ludlum. I read a lot of Stephen King. I actually had a very strong aversion to classic fantasy when I was growing up because it seemed exclusive. It seemed like if I didn't memorize an entire fictional language, if I didn't prove that I belonged in that club in some way, that I didn't deserve to be there. And so it actually took me a very long time to come to fantasy. I knew I was going to write strange books, but I mean, I was reading Neil Gaiman, and I was reading Kelly Link, and I was reading these books that were strange, and they weren't. They were inclusive because it was a strangeness that was so close to reality. But it took me a really long time, actually. Darker Shade of Magic is my 8th book. And it took me a long time to find my way into a place where I felt comfortable writing fantasy. And even still, I made a really strong decision when I started that series that I was going to make it as accessible as possible because I wanted it to be there for the version of me that wouldn't have had the courage to read something like that.
I started out as a mystery reader. Basically, Nancy Drew was what I imprinted on at a very young age and mainlined way more of those than I really care to count. Like the case files, the little white books. Oh, yeah. I was up to like 100 some odd of those things. But it's not like that was at a point when I wasn't paying attention to genre boundaries. Like I said, I was reading The Secret Garden as if it were fantasy. And it's not that I wasn't uninterested in fantasy, and what tipped me over the line into that being my genre was actually Diana Wynne Jones. Reading a lot of her books, and specifically it was Fire and Hemlock that made me say, I want to be a writer. And so I sat down and started writing out some notes for a story I never wrote that was some horrible bog standard, quest fantasy because I was 10. But yeah, that was the moment at which I really started being a fantasy person rather than some other genre. And so it was never any question in my mind that I was going to write fantasy. And it's interesting to me what you said about the accessibility, because one of the things that draws me to fantasy, I love urban fantasy and so on, but I went to grad school in anthropology. I love the richness that you can get with a fully developed world where, certainly there are ways to present it that are more or less accessible to the reader. So if it's presented in a way that allows me to get into it, I love that sense of being taken to something that is different on so many fronts with all these little, I always think of writing in terms of textiles. It's like bits of embroidery on it. That's one of the things that I just really kind of love the genre for.
I started out writing science fiction, and in fact, when I was a kid, I read science fiction and horror, and the idea of fantasy, I hated it. But I hadn't read it. I just had this idea of what fantasy was. It's just a bunch of people making up crap. And I read Tolkien.
Do that.
Yeah, I read Tolkien as a kid and enjoyed it, but I didn't quite associate it with fantasy. It seemed like an adventure thing. It did seem very rigorous. It was like this sort of, you were saying anthropology. It seemed like almost an anthropological book to me. That's how it felt. And it wasn't until I was already writing books that my agent was saying, your style and the kind of stuff you're writing about, if you pushed it a little further, you would be writing fantasy. And I said, I have no interest. And she said, shut up and read Neil Gaiman.
Yes, exactly.
and Holly Black.
Yeah.
And those are actually the two writers that convinced me also that I could write a YA book at one point. Yeah. But seeing Gaiman especially was the one, and even Sandman, and then I went to the novels later, that there was something more to this than the prejudice I carry my whole life about fantasy. And then I haven't, I've written some science fiction short fiction stories in the last 10 years maybe, but I have no interest in writing science fiction novels anymore. The fantasy part, working with alternate belief systems that you can find in these things. Hey, man.
Hey. So y'all switch down?
All right, man. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, okay.
That's my story. We're talking about what's the right phrase? Sort of where you started from, how you got into fantasy, or
what made you a fantasy writer
as an adult?
Yeah.
I never left fantasy. That was all. That was all I read, really. And still, I mostly read fantasy, science fiction, and then nonfiction. I feel like a lot of literary stories are depressing, and if I'm going to be depressed, I might as well read nonfiction and actually oh, this actually happened to someone. That feels better. Yeah, so I've always been a big fantasy and science fiction fan. That was never a question of what I was going to write. It was always going to be that.
Well, and I just want to say real fast, getting into this, the prejudice against fantasy. So non-readers of fantasy or non-readers of fantasy and science fiction often make the erroneous assumption that science fiction has rules and fantasy doesn't, you know? And that's that initial impression, whereas science fiction has a specific kind of rules and fantasy has a specific kind of rules. And fantasy's rules are usually slightly more naturalistic or slightly more hidden within the world, whereas science fiction's rules. Plus, I was on a panel with Ken Liu, who's a very hard science fiction writer, and he made a perfect point, which is that roughly after World War II, a layman's understanding of science became such that essentially most science fiction these days is fantasy. That if you were to write a science fiction these days, unless it was extremely hard science fiction, most people wouldn't be able to read it.
Right, yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, and I would also add that I just kind of laugh every time people go, oh, fantasy, you can just make things up. Because while there is a great deal of making things up, no question about it, the sheer amount of research that I have done for my books, because unless you're writing something that is very surreal, which most of us aren't doing, then most of the genre is not really full-on surrealism, you need to make the things that are realistic look real, right, in order to make the fantastical parts of it work. And actually the anthropology thing, and you brought up hard science fiction, it's not, nobody quite agrees on what the term hard fantasy ought to mean, but for me it has meant for a while now things that are what I think of as anthropologically rigorous, things where the way the society works makes sense, the way that the government fits in with the religion, etc. Those things actually mesh in a believable manner. And so it's funny to me that you sort of mentioned Tolkien for this, because while he's great with the mythology and the linguistics, the actual practical workings of Middle-earth are a little fuzzy in many places. Like, what does everybody in Lothlorien eat? Where is the lembas grown, etc. You know.
I read it when I was 15. I wasn't thinking about the economic systems yet.
And neither was I at that age. But there's a great deal of realism that goes into the modern fantasy genre on the whole, and it's the tension between making things feel real so that you can have that belief of maybe things could be like this, with then the layer of, and then this is not real.
That brings me to my secret contentious question. Because there's been a controversy in recent years in fantasy about demographic diversity, let's say, in medieval fantasy, and people saying, oh, well, how ridiculous, you have a black person in medieval Europe, when of course you have dragons in medieval Europe.
Right.
You know, at the very least, a black person can ride a dragon from Africa to Europe, right? That should be the very least thing that could possibly happen. So I guess there is some sort of implicit set of bones that people bring to a book, that's some expectations. So when we look at a Gaiman book, I can summarize every Gaiman book right now. Storytelling is magic, right? Yes, that's pretty much it. So if you want to adopt that sounds good to you. You're going to like a Gaiman book. I don't. And otherwise, you have people sort of trying to subvert tropes, but claiming they're not subverting them by saying, well, this is what actually would happen because of the rigorism of realism. My issue is that a lot of medieval fantasy, once you have things like flying carpets and teleportation spells, shouldn't be medieval for very long, because you'd have a lot more trade And someone would say, "Oh, we got magic carpets. Let's make 10,000 of them. Let's get the Silk Road going real quick." And and it would change the rest of the economy. So we're all sort of, I guess we'd say, in the biggest terms, progressive fantasists. We're trying to do new things. And how do you approach those questions in your writing? You can go first, Naman, since you've been so late. Okay.
So diversity in my fiction, is that the question? Or just how I dressed?
In your fiction and in other people's fiction. So you can slam people now?
Oh, well, that's
Also, talk about yourself.
a good place to be. It's what I do best. So I was never a fan of Tolkien. I never could get through the first 100 pages of the first book. I just didn't care. And for me, that's the death knell of a book. If I don't care about the characters at all, I'm just like, you could die and I would be happy because the book would be over. So what's the point of me keep reading? So like that's something. I think that number one, there's a great Tumblr that everyone should look at called Medieval POC. That is a person who gathers actual medieval evidence that, guess what, there were brown people in the medieval times. Here are paintings, here are all these things. And often they're paintings that are recognizable to us, but cropped. So there'll be interesting things where they're like, here's what you usually see of this painting. And when we expand it out, here are the two black people on either side of the throne that were always there, but you never saw. So there's that happening. Recently, like my book just came out, there is, and I didn't even realize this
What's
until...
the name of your book? You got an audience here, right?
The name of my book is The Root, and it's the first in a urban fantasy meets high fantasy trilogy, and it's for sale. Put on my Vanna sales voice. But recently someone wrote a little quick review for it on their blog, and they really liked it. And one of the things they noticed is they were like, and I can count the number of white characters on one hand, and that's actually interesting to me because this is complete opposite of what urban fantasy usually is. And that actually I hadn't thought about that. I had just written my friends group. Like I had just written like the people I hang out with. I grew up in LA and San Francisco. I've never had a friends group that was all white. I've always had Latino friends and Asian friends and queer friends and disabled friends. And when I read all these urban fantasies where it's set in New York, but you don't even run into a brown person, which New York is that? It just didn't reflect my experience at all. And so I think I try and write fun fantasies that are great and interesting and have adventures, and they just happen to look like the real world.
All right.
I'm trying to do something similar, but for exactly the same reason. I mean, you pretty much answered the question for me. Like, I grew up in New York and moved to LA, but in between, I lived in Houston, Texas, and coming from Brooklyn to Houston, Texas was the first time actually really I was aware of race, because we moved to the whitest place in America at the time, and we had a 3,000 person high school in Houston, Texas, 25 years ago, and 2 black kids. And it was just, you could just hear the weirdness that came out of it. Like, nobody said anything overt that I'd ever run into, but just that level of weird tension that was there that never in New York and certainly never in LA. And wanting to reflect that experience, becoming aware of it sort of in the middle of my life in Texas. Made me really aware of like trying to, even if I screw things up sometimes, trying to reflect the real world. And, not being a jerk, just basically, I think there's something just juvenile about that, the sort of the Friends version of New York. That's what I always think of, is that show of just that kind of just everything awful about culture and pop culture is sort of embodied in that thing. And I basically try to write unfriends fantasy fiction. So that's my goal in life.
Somebody needs to write an urban fantasy set in New York titled Unfriends.
Unfriends.
So The two of them have already addressed the things set in the real world pretty well, so I'll turn to the ones that are set in a secondary world. And anytime I hear somebody saying, well, I can't have brown people in this, I can't have gay people, I can't have women or whatever because history, I'm like, okay, you've just proved to me you haven't read any actual history. There's a book that I came across when I was doing research for my previous series. I don't remember the author's name, but it's titled Bloody Foreigners, and it's about the history of immigration into the UK, which goes back way further than most people in the UK really remember. And it gives a lot of evidence for the fact that, yeah, there were lots of not English people in England, including people from like other continents from way further back than you think. And this is something that really gets up my nose with, I may be jumping the gun slightly, but before the panel we had among ourselves brought up the topic of grimdark fantasy and such. And I get really annoyed by the selective realism of that kind of thing, especially because they like to trumpet the realism as being a selling point of it.
You actually can just describe grimdark for people who don't know.
Okay, so like Game of Thrones is kind of one of the things that got, or rather A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series, was sort of one of the early leading edges of that. And now it's like Joe Abercrombie and people like that, where you've got your very like gritty crapsack kind of world where everything is awful and people betray each other at every turn and there's loving descriptions of filth and so forth. And yet, one of the things that gets a lot of sexual violence, and since you brought that up, one of the things that annoys the hell out of me with the selective realism is there's a lot of sexual violence against women and almost none against men, which if you actually read about the history of warfare is not really how it goes. So the one-sidedness of that, the fact that like another issue of diversity is showing people with disabilities. If you read actual history, holy crap, people lived with a level of illness and pain and injury that is inconceivable to us today. Like, there's a sense in which if you're writing about somebody in your medieval period who's completely able-bodied, you're writing about a unicorn because, no, really, people were just, their bodies were not in as good shape as ours are for a whole host of reasons. So, you know, on the one hand, I get very annoyed at the people who say, I can't include this because history. I'm like, yeah, go read some actual history. But even if you've decided, okay, I am going to write about a version of Europe where there weren't any contacts with Africa and the Middle East and Asia and so forth, that's your choice. That is a decision that the author made that they were going to write about a world where there wasn't long-distance trade and there weren't refugees and wars and other things that cause immigration. And that is a choice the author can be held responsible for. You don't just get to wave it off and say, well, that's just the way it is because you made it that way.
It's very true. That is... a lot of really wonderful things have already been said, so I'll keep this brief. So I write what would be called second world fantasy, or as Marie put it earlier before this panel, a world and a half, which means I have 4 versions of London in my book. Only one of them is based in any form of reality, right? The others are all named London because of a very small quirk of history. And Grey London is my realistic 1819. And there are some issues that I face in that I have a female character coming from that world who in modern days might consider herself gender fluid. And that's a term that I don't get to give to her in an 1819 context. However, the moment I step out of Grey London into Red London, I have an entirely fantastical world. I have a London that is not based on London. If anything, it is based on a much more Eastern, a richer, the royal family and the vast majority of people are brown-skinned. One of my main characters is the prince of that, and he's bisexual, and he is brown-skinned, and he is royalty, and sexuality, and gender, and almost everything really takes a backseat to power. And so while there are gender dynamics, and while there are sexual norms, your power is more important, because power is the social currency. It is the way this world functions, and
this one.
yeah, it's the way the world functions. And really, for me, I felt like not only you could say I had no excuse to have an absence of diversity, I relished the opportunity to have a presence of diversity. I was creating Red London and White London, for that matter, which is one London further still. And I thought, I have this incredible opportunity to reflect what in many ways is our modern reality and to take it. And I'm appalled by people who do, as Marie says, when they create a world that is entirely their own creation and then they make it narrow They make it forcibly white. They make it forcibly straight. They make it forcibly all these things that they had no reason except their own personal preference, and for that they should be held accountable. For me, I'm a member of the LGBT community. I am female. I would like to see people in positions of power who are not traditional depictions of fantasy. And so I really relish the opportunity in sculpting these multiple worlds to have multiple visible variations of power. And so, yes, there are worlds in which the people in power are white men, and there are worlds in which the people in power are brown royal families, and there are worlds in which people in power are horrible women, and they're one of the strongest people in my entire series is this gender fluid woman, you know? And so like, and I liked being able to explore that. And I definitely am aware of the fact that I don't just throw everything out the window and be like, there are no norms. There are norms, but the hierarchy gets to shift and the emphasis gets to shift. And you know what? My prince, in a lot of ways, has much more freedom than someone of a lower echelon would to sleep with who he likes and to be with who he likes because he's the prince. And he's held accountable for that in many ways, that he is in love with somebody from a different echelon of society for whom it is not acceptable. You know, and so I do play with that, but I think it's more important to see myself and for other people to see themselves in fantasy as just as important as I think it is for them to see themselves in realistic fiction. You know, we talk about this a lot in publishing right now, that you have to be able to see yourself. Everyone should be able to see themselves, you know? And so that I feel like is one of the few moments where I'll talk about authorial responsibility in fiction, is to make sure that more people can see themselves depicted in positions of power.
You don't want to be depicted in my books. Okay. But anyway, now we're going to open up the floor to questions. And audience members, pay close attention to these instructions. If you have a question, raise your right hand. If you have a comment that is something that does not end with a question mark, raise your left hand. If you just want to talk about your own book, don't raise either hand. Do we have any questions? We have a question here in the third row.
I think I'm close enough to just...
I will repeat the question for the audience.
So talking about authorial intent, I'm curious, and responsibility, I'm curious, there's a lot of tropes of, you know, the black guy dies first, the queer people are killed off. So how would you manage, like, how do you do it responsibly if you want to have a character who's going to be the villain and you're like, well, I kind of want to make this character queer, but I also don't want to be saying, like, all queer people are villains. Like, how do you like manage that with a good intent but have it not come off as like negative?
How do you write bad queer people? Namin?
I think the way that you write, like, people die in my books. Shit happens. It's not a crap sack world, but it's a world that shit happens in. The point is to not make sure that queer villain is not your only queer character. That's where people get into trouble. Whenever I talk about diversity in books and stuff like that, I'm like, I'm not saying you can't make your villain a woman or queer or of color or disabled or all these things. What I'm saying is that that's the one representation that you have. That's where you get tricky, because when you're, especially people who are writing a non-diverse world, there's plenty of examples of white men. There's white men that are villains, there are white men that are heroes, there are people that are neutral. But when you have like that one representation of a queer person, or that Tolkien, like the one representation of a woman, like that's all you have, then that representation becomes super, super charged because it's the only one there. And so whoever's reading you that doesn't identify with everyone else and identifies with that character, that's all they have. I was at a panel at WizCon last weekend called Queer Eye for Sci-Fi, where a lot of the things we talked about was that we identified with the villains, because a lot of the villains were coded queer when we were coming up, and that's who we had to identify with. You know, the woman who wasn't told, you didn't know she was sleeping, but she had a harem of women who were scantily dressed around her, and she was like the evil space queen. It was all
what book is this?
Any golden age sci-fi. But that's who we had to identify with. So I think as long as you have a multitude of like queer identities, the problem is much easier to handle.
And watch out for making queerness or other issues the reason for the villainy.
Yes.
Like, oh, I was so fucked up as a kid, I'm so confused, I must chop people up and wear their suits, that kind of thing, yeah.
That's the other thing. I read a book recently where the reason the woman was the villain was because she was ugly. and she was so bitter that she was ugly that she had turned to villainhood. And I was like, I have some issues with this.
And I think some of that comes from when you base a character around, whatever that minority identity is for them, and that's like the defining thing of their character, as opposed to here is somebody who is A, B, C, D, E, and also queer. If the entire thing that defines them is their queerness, then anything you say about them, of like them being a villain or whatever, will be linked with that. Whereas if there's somebody who has like 6 different markers of identity and that is one, that linkage is less fraught.
I was surprised. I was doing a group interview with some younger, sort of early 20s writers. It was all dudes. That's a good start. And I was really surprised. They came out of gaming into writing, and I was really surprised by people in their 20s having that weird attitude of like, I was trying to talk about diversity, and they kept coming back to, well, there's a gay character, it has to be part of the plot. It's like, who do you have lunch with? I mean, anywhere you're having lunch with in the world, there are straight people and gay people and fluid people and black people, and it's not the fucking plot. It's who you have lunch with. Like, look around in the world. And it was one of the weirdest, most frustrating conversations. And again, I have to admit to myself that I haven't run many 20-year-olds like that, but it was... maybe it's I don't know the gaming world.
No,
well.
the gaming world is terrible. It's the worst. They're the worst people.
Is that true?
Yes.
I don't. Okay, so
it goes
was
books,
a weird audience.
movies, TV, video games, then the paper pen and games. So it just all dribbles down.
Okay.
Like ideas dribble down.
So that was just my.
The video games.
That was
exactly.
that was sort of my naivete, sort of going into that thing.
Yeah.
All right, that was well. Thank you for you.
Any
educated
questions
me.
about gamers that we can answer? Okay, we have 3 questions. So you first.
When you were writing like your diverse books and people of other races and genders and sexualities, did you like make mistakes in your first drafts and like say things that were like, not accurately representing those people, and how did you overcome those?
Are you awful, and how did you stop?
So I'll totally admit, I was kind of talking jokingly up here before the panel. Before I wrote Darker Shade of Magic, I wrote a book called Vicious. And Vicious is about 2 white men who dislike each other. It is one of the least, it's the cast has 5 people, right? Like, so and it was very purposefully not diverse because it was very tongue-in-cheek play on superhero culture and things like that. But I came from that into Darker Shade of Magic, and in my first draft, I didn't have nearly as much diversity as I could have had. There was no reason. Like, I had characters who were vital to the plot, and then I had characters who were secondary and tertiary characters, and I did not have a wide enough lens. I wasn't really challenging myself to think outside of my own. I had LGBT characters, but I had not enough race diversity. I had not enough ability diversity. And it was a thing where there was no reason not to. And it was actually my editor who, in the first round of revisions, really talked me through it and was like, look, like, is there a reason you don't, or are you just not paying enough attention? And I'm young, and it was a mess up on my part. And I was like, you're absolutely right. I want to have more. And so I sat down and we looked at the characters, and I will admit, there was only one character that proved intensely problematic for me, and it was Holland. There's a bad guy in the first book, and I really wanted to make him more diverse, but the stuff that happens to him, I felt like it would have been really irresponsible, And I mean, and he's a very complicated character, but I felt like the initial impression on him was going to be like, you have taken a minority character and you've hurt them the worst. And so there's a reason he is probably the whitest character in that whole series. I was like, okay, just literally make him totally colorless. This dude is so white, right? Like, he has no, like, he's just, because, and that was a thing that, like, I definitely struggled in creating the primary set of main characters, Rye is the darkest skinned of them, and I think if you hope for one happy ending in that series, you probably are gonna get it for the like queer dark-skinned person, and I just want him to be happy. Like, I put him, all of my white characters are probably gonna die. I'm sorry, that's not true. Don't worry. But it was a thing that it was definitely like my first draft of Darker Shade of Magic was not diverse enough, and it was diverse, but it was definitely not as diverse as it could have been for a second world fantasy.
Yeah, I was lucky that kind of like with what you were saying with Holland, had a chance to catch something that could have, I think, been pretty bad. I'm not going to specify which book this is because it would be a spoiler. But a particular book where I'd been thinking about the plot of it for quite some time, and there was a character who I knew was going to be really important in the story, and so I said, okay, I'm going to make them a character of color, because this was when I was starting to really prod those defaults and say, all right, let me not just let myself cruise on autopilot here. But then, the character's developing, et cetera, and then I stopped and looked and went, and that's somebody I'm planning on killing at the end of the book in a particular fashion that would read really badly if I did that to a character of color in a story where there aren't that many of them. So yes, even though I could have had a greater diversity of representation by having that character not be white, in that context, it would have been a terrible idea. So that one got changed before it ever went out in the world. Certainly I know for me, I am still very much in the stage of trying to make sure that I'm constantly checking those defaults and not just going with what the most obvious thing is. And because with the current series, I'm sending my white main character to many different parts of the world, a lot of it is doing the research into the areas that she's going to and trying to she doesn't get any kind of insider point of view on those cultures, so it's always being seen from the perspective of somebody from outside, but trying to make sure that I'm getting as much of that right as I can, and that's just, you do your homework and you get people to read it over.
For me, it was learning to be more careful with language, just on that simplest level, thinking about word choices, thinking about pronouns. I was very sloppy with pronouns when I started out. Now it's sort of like one of the things I'm always looking for in my fiction. And when I was younger, they were just dumb mistakes. I look back. There's one that's just horribly embarrassing. I keep waiting. It's weird to want one of your own books to go out of print. But there's one particular book where I really fucking hate this. I mean, I misidentified a trans person. And it bugs the shit out of me. I was able to correct it in the audiobook and to go back and fix it in the ebook. But the print book, it's still there, and it drives me crazy.
Lucky print is dead.
Exactly. It's one of those things where I become very conscious of trying to get words right and make sure you just don't make dumb mistakes. And it was just youth and just sloppy dumbness of youth, and which I've tried since then to be really, really careful about.
I was going to say, do your research, Avi. But the other thing, I said that in public. Damn. I did that on another panel last weekend. I do it when I'm tired. I'm sorry. So there's that, but also sensitivity readers, if you're that worried. Don't just ask your friends of color or your queer friends to read your novel. Pay them. This is emotional labor. If you want someone to go through, the same way you would pay a copy editor, the same way you would pay someone else to go through your book, you want someone, if you're that worried. Also, if you're doing something a little more modern, the characters don't really have... If you're doing a specific culture, like you were talking about going to other cultures and having to... But if you're doing, this just happens to be a diverse cast in America, you really don't have to make your characters talk all that different. And in fact, if you do, then it becomes a thing all of a sudden. If the gay character's really sassy and snappy, I mean, yeah, I know people like that. Sometimes I am a person like that. But if all your gay characters talk that way, it's we're very Americanized and there's a code switching thing that happens. I would also argue that if you need to do so much research about an aspect of a marginalized culture, you need to read 30 books and do all this, maybe that's not your story to tell. If you need to dive so deeply into this other culture and understand everything about it because you want to write about something that's endemic to that culture, maybe that's just not your story.
If I can add just one brief anecdote, not from my own work, but regarding kind of screwing a thing up and fixing it. In the Dragon Age video games, specifically in Inquisition, the most recent one, there is a trans character that during the drafting of the script for it, Patrick Weeks was writing this scene where this trans man and all of his friends are hanging out and chatting, and one of them makes a comment about the guy having to bind his chest. And it was meant to be a, like, oh, they're good friends, like they can talk about this, but it didn't read that way to the people that Patrick Weeks, the writer, handed it off to. And it turned out in that case to be as simple as flipping it around and having Krem, the trans character, saying to his friend, like, man, we'd have a really hard time wrapping your chest, and just having that line be coming from him changed the entire tenor of that situation, because they wanted to have it come out somewhere in this story that this character was trans, because if he flies completely under the radar, then it's not going to register on the player. So they needed some moment where it was going to come out, but having it come out through something that Krem said as a joke, rather than it being something said to Krem as a joke, just made the power balance of that entire exchange very different. So sometimes it's that simple. Just kind of flip around who is the one that drives that moment in the conversation.
So your question was next?
I was going to ask, fantasy and to some extent science fiction are two of the areas where you'll actually see other species, intelligent species, interact with your characters, and in some cases be the main characters. And how do you integrate having completely different cultures then interact with characters that are not our typical norm, and bringing them together?
Oh, well, this brings up one of my pet peeves, in that, sure, the question was about other species, like intelligent species, a fictional species in a fantasy or science fiction setting. And since we're talking about issues of diversity, the thing that annoys the hell out of me a lot are aliens or elves, or who are secretly Chinese or secretly Japanese. Yeah, or Jewish too. Yeah.
Don't do it.
And it's not even like actual Chinese or Japanese people. It's like the TV Chinese or Japanese people. So it's even doubly worse. And I always just found that really horrifying, especially when they do things like win Hugo Awards, which happened not too long ago. So I'll throw that over to the rest of you, especially let's start with the anthropologist. That might be a very good way to start. Start with the expert answer.
Yeah, it's when you get the story where, okay, there's diversity because you have the white humans and then you have the elves and dwarves and so on who stand in for other colors of human. No, that is called erasure and dehumanization and so forth. So if you're going to have, there's actually a story that a novel series that I'm kind of making some plans for maybe at some point in the future, and I will be having non-human species in it. So one of my thoughts is, okay, so now how do we make sure that we build in a lot of diversity in the human community so that it is clear these are not merely allegorical representations of other human ethnicities? And then the other side to it, which I still don't see very often, and I think we need more of this, is when you get your elves or your dwarves or whatever species, they're homogenous. And it's weird to me to be praising this because in most respects it's really resoundingly mediocre, but MTV made a TV series of Terry Brooks' Shannara stuff, and there are black elves. Not as a drow dark elves Forgotten Realms kind of way, it's just here's the elven kingdom and they have different colors of skin. I still don't see that very often. You still get very homogenous fantasy races, fantasy species, and I'd love to see more of that being changed up.
And just to piggyback off that, when it's not a homogenous species, it's that split down the middle of the light ones who live in the forest and the darker skinned ones who live underground. Thank you. Biology. I'm not going to name names, but I was reading a graphic novel recently by a well-known science fiction and fantasy author, and it was an original story.
We're going to guess after this.
You can guess if you want, and I will tell you if you're right. And half the world is completely in the darkness, and half the world is always sunlight. All the people in the sunlit world, where there were some brownish people, but they're all white with blonde hair. And then the people from the dark side of the world come and they're all black. And I was like, if you had mixed it, if you just made it diverse everywhere, I would have been like, oh, immigration, people have switched. But that doesn't make sense. Melanin doesn't develop in complete darkness. That's why things that live underground are pale and eyeless and
I would just add to that pet peeve on top of that is when alien species have the same value systems. So like when they're still like super heteronormative and like have the identical value systems to the human species. Yeah, or like have the same systems of any kind, like that they become this, like, that's when it really, for me, that's my immediate tip off that I'm like, oh, this is just going to be allegory for somebody else. Like, you're not actually making a diverse.
Yeah. Or when everything non-normative in our society gets offloaded to them.
Yeah, that's what I'm, there's a lot of ways
they're all gay and none of us are.
Yeah, and you're like, come on, man. Because then it continues that allegorical setting where you're just passing off a version of minority or a version of diversity onto the alien.
Yeah. Hang on, we had, were you the third person we called on the
No, it was the guy in the front who's going now.
Okay, then old person over here, sorry. Go ahead, you go.
Well, Richard made a comment earlier about he'd like to be in a room and the rest of his life and just type. I'd like to know about how each of you approach your writing process.
The how do you fold your socks question. Yeah. Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Victoria.
I actually do almost no writing at my computer. I do the vast majority, I do my typing at my computer, but I do my writing all during the day, wherever I am at all times, either on a notepad or on my phone. I'm taking notes constantly. I am one of those believers that if you never get out of the room, you have nothing to write about. So I do a lot of traveling. I do a lot of taking on odd jobs and exploring things I don't really understand or knowledge bases I don't have.
Latest odd job?
My latest odd job, I volunteered in a homeless shelter. Yeah, and before that, I took lessons in firing handguns because I'm right, because I try to move from learning one thing to learning another thing constantly. And learning writing is the thing you learn while you're writing, but I don't want to just sit and write. I want to make sure I have something to write about. I just went and got a master's degree in depictions of monsters in medieval worlds. So I have a Master of Monsters degree from the University of Edinburgh. So I moved to Scotland for a year because I wanted to see something else. One time I moved to Liverpool for 3 months because I had 3 months to finish writing a book, and I thought, hey, I can sit in a room in Liverpool, or I can sit in a room in Nashville, which is where I lived at the time, and I was like, let's do something different. And so I ended up living in a shed in a backyard in Liverpool. Don't ever do that. It's a horrible thing. But anyway, my whole point is, like, it varies. I travel most of the time. Sometimes I'm traveling for work, and so there's an idea that you should have as few restrictions on your writing as possible. So people are like, I have to have a cup of tea, and it has to be this temperature, and I have to have a sandwich, and it has to be cut like this, and I have to have perfect light. You will never write. What you're doing is building excuses to not write. I tend to try and have as few constraints as possible aside from relative quiet and an hour of time.
I would actually say I agree with you. Don't set up perfect conditions for yourself. But I did, by accident, when writing my first novel, rediscover the principles of Pavlovian conditioning. Because the one thing I will rely on is music. It helps me to have music playing when I write. And if I pick certain pieces of music that I associate with a novel, it makes getting started much easier. Because starting to type, that's hard. But just hitting play on iTunes, that's just one click. I can manage one click. The music starts playing and brain starts going, okay, yeah, now we're thinking about the book. Other than that, I'm a night owl. I have been since I was 10, so I'm usually writing at about 1 o'clock in the morning. But the actual writing process doesn't make for a very interesting story for me.
To piggyback off what you said, I think travel for me is like the single most interesting and important thing a writer can do. Is just sort of to confront yourself and to confront other worlds and other assumptions about the world. If you can manage it.
Like getting on I spent a summer just getting on Greyhound buses and traveling around to small towns in America.
Exactly. It doesn't. Yeah, you don't have to go to another country, but just to get out of whatever world you grew up with. For me, I do a lot of work. It varies between the computer and by hand. I pretty much start all books by hand in a moleskin cahier. And when I start writing, I will switch back and forth from handwritten to the computer. Usually the best thing for me, and I recommend this for any other writer, if you ever get stuck, change your writing method. That's the best thing in the world. That's helped me. So if I'm on the computer and I get stuck, go to pen and paper. You're on pen and paper and things are slowing down, go to the computer. And then I'll do a lot of voice recognition. The notes from the notebook I'll speak into the computer, and that's kind of nice too because I get to edit as I go along. So it's not a first draft; it's sort of first and a half. And yeah, it's pretty simple. Beyond that.
So I'm constrained by debt and poverty. I mean, it's real. I work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and I have 2 and 2.5 hours commute on top of that each day. So when I get home, I'm exhausted. So working towards being able to do a lot and travel and do all these things is like totally a dream of mine. Right now, I have to have I'm under deadline. I used to write everything out longhand and then type it up because, like, when I typed it up, I edited it. It felt like a great process. I simply don't have the time to do that anymore if I want to get writing done. I'm sad about that because I think that it's helpful to have these longer processes, but I just don't have the time or energy or space to do that right now. So I basically come home, I set aside maybe 3 hours. I write for an hour. Music is really important to me. My first book is dedicated to Beyonce. And people laugh when I say that, but I'm like, that music actually helped me get through like 14-hour editing days because Beyonce believes that she can do anything. And so if you start to believe it too, you're like, you start to believe it too, and you're like, I can totally do this for 14 hours straight. Like, I'm good. She believes in me. I believe in me. And so the same way certain books have certain music attached to it that helps me write. The second book in the trilogy I'm writing right now is I'm listening to a lot of Kehlani, who's like a local Oakland performer. And I do a reward system. There's the music, but then like for an hour of writing, I get to go watch like an episode of Steven Universe or an episode of Grace and Frankie or whatever TV show like I'm into at that moment. I get to reward myself for an hour of writing with like an episode of TV, and then I go back and do another hour and trade off until the screen starts to blur, and then I go to bed.
I use rewards the exact same way. Like I will binge watch it. I'm on Penny Dreadful right now, and I will binge watch it. Like with it, it's the thing that gets you through those really long deadline days.
Yeah. Totally, and it's like you're working hard, and you're like, I can't write one more sentence. You're like, but if I just keep going for 10 minutes. Yeah. The new episode of like whatever is waiting for me, and that will rejuvenate me.
In terms of music, it's interesting you mentioned Beyonce. I listen to a lot of music, but nothing with lyrics. Yeah. It doesn't get in your head to hear a singer and the words.
No, I actually have the opposite problem. Like I love a lot of instrumental music. I have a whole playlist that is and I'm gonna forget her name. Very famous Vietnamese violinist. She's one of my favorites. What? Vanessa Mae, yes. I have a whole playlist that's not like 7 hours of Vanessa Mae. And so sometimes I'll listen to that, but the lyrics actually help me because, I'll be going along for 25 minutes writing, and all of a sudden, like, Freedom by Beyonce will come on, and it'll be like, the lyric that'll, like, scream out to me is like, you don't quit, and like, a winner doesn't quit on themselves. And all of a sudden I'm like, you're right, and then I just go back in. Like, it's very easy. I have that sort of weird attention split thing where as a teenager I would watch TV, read a book, and write I'd have all three going at once. And I was like, I've already seen this episode. I don't need to pay that much attention, but it's like background noise. Yeah. And then I'm doing these two things, and no one else could understand me, but splitting my attention actually lets me focus more.
See, the only time I can do songs with lyrics is if I've literally listened to it 115 times on repeat, so it becomes background music. Mm-hmm. My favorite thing besides classical, because classical is really great for editing, it keeps me calm, but for writing, I do video game soundtracks. Like Bastion is one of the best video games. It's like a Darker Shade of Magic is essentially like you could read it while playing Bastion's soundtrack in the background, and it works perfectly because they've got the highs and lows in a way that like on a shorter time frame than a symphony does. Oh, yeah.
I've got a huge collection of film scores because, no lyrics. I do listen to some things with lyrics, but they have to fit what I am writing in a way that it's hard for me to find good matches. But also that film scores are made to tell a story. And so they have moods to them in a way that I'll have my creepy playlist for a book. I'll have my like battle playlist for the book. And so I switch between them as I'm going. And I actually end up making like novel soundtracks at the end. I put together like a mix CD effectively that is, now I'm going to pick out things, for this book that ends up being, I don't outline, but I sort of make a musical outline of the book and then I revise and it helps.
There's one other thing I forgot to mention that I do is I usually have a movie running on a monitor with the sound off. Just because I have those moments when I stop and if I look up,
Not in the mic.
oh, sorry, if I look up from that silent film playing, it's just this bit of visual stimulation that keeps me, it keeps the creative thing going. And the film can be anything from Godzilla to Werkmeister Harmonies by, Bellatar. I mean, any of that range. I had Earth versus the Flying Saucers on the other night, and my cat was trying to eat all the aliens, which was an interesting kind of stimulation in itself. But having that weird little bit of something visual going on. And I'll have that sometimes, and I'll have the music going, just to sort of, it keeps the synapses firing for me.
So the important issue for a process is that everyone's process is somewhat different because it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, and it gets the book done and it gets a publishable book done, whether it makes you feel good or bad, is not, because people often want to feel good.
Yeah, of course.
And so they write in some method that makes them feel good and the stuff is terrible. Or they want to feel bad. They want to feel punished by the world.
Well,
it's the two kinds of narcissism.
And this is like a perfect example of this is like I write a lot of books, and so a lot of people assume I'm an extremely fast writer. I am not. I'm a very slow writer who writes every day. And I have friends who will write one day a week because that's what they have, or that's just how their brains work, and they'll write 10,000 words in that one day. And I'll write 1,000 words or 1,500 words every single day. So there is no right way to do this, and both of our books will hit shelves. And I'll be like, damn you, because you wrote 52 days of the year, and I wrote 365 days of the year. Exactly, but it's what they do. It's whatever works.
And just to give another example of how arbitrary it is, I do a lot of mental manipulation. And I've done it with all facets of my life. So I'm one of the people who can fall asleep anywhere instantly. I can do it right now if you wanted me to. Because I've trained myself to do it. Yeah. And I've trained myself to enter like a click, like a writing mode. Partially just from my background, which was writing term papers for college kids for years. And I would write 6-7 papers a day. So things that weren't writing 6-7 papers a day, I would have half an hour. So I didn't have any time to, do anything other than say, okay, now it's time to go. And just do it. And I just mentally compose a first sentence, find the voice of the character, and then go on forward. In fact, a lot of my stuff is in the first person because of that. Other thing I do, you can find this on YouTube. I don't know if anybody knows. Probably some of you do. It's a phenomenon called ASMR, right? And I do that. So you listen to music, I listen to people doing this. And some people like it, and some people are driven crazy by it, right, Naaman? Yeah? So I listen to a lot of ASMR videos, people talking about their day or chewing gum or ironing a shirt. If you ever remember that TV show with Bob Ross, The Joy of Painting, people like that show? That's the ASMR effect. It's a made-up thing. It's called something sensory meridian response. There's no such thing as a meridian. It just gives people some sort of a semi-orgasmic experience. And other people, it's just a noise. So go home and find out which one you are and report back to us later. Okay, anyway, we had a question over here.
What advice would you give on creating a realistic, anthropologically rich fantasy world, like Marie said earlier? What makes it, realistic for you, even though a lot of it is made up?
Well, that question was so good, I'm going to forgive myself for calling on her early. Is that okay? Okay. You can start again.
The question, how do you make a world feel anthropologically real? And it's something I've actually been chewing on that question a bit because I'd like to write, some blog posts or something, sort of talking about what it is that I'm looking for. But it's a thing that's hard to break apart, in part because of the way that anthropology is, as an academic field, a thing that encompasses many other fields within it. And it's about how those things fit together. So the only actual concrete advice I can really give is to read lots of stuff about real places in the world and think about how those things fit together. And just because, the more of it you see, the more it kind of makes sense in your own brain. There are theories that can help with it, like anthropological stuff saying, all right, well, if you have your kinship system structured in the following fashion, then you're probably going to have your government working in this way. But approaching it from the theoretical side isn't really how I do it. It's just kind of you see how things do work together and how they don't, which, like I said, isn't helpful. I've been trying to figure out how to explain it better.
I was just gonna say, for me, like as a reader and a writer, it's the details. And it's not necessarily the same details in every world. There are some fantasy worlds where like the history of that world is intensely detailed. Like the author has taken time to sketch out this whole history and drops in little nuggets, and that makes it feel real for me. Even if like the governmental structure or other things feel a little shaky, there are all these details that make that world feel expansive. And the same thing for someone who's focused on culinary. I've read books where they focused on like the food of this culture, and I was like, yeah, this feels real to me.
Yeah.
Even though, because I can taste it. But even if I looked at like maybe the history of the world a little too closely, I'd be like, well, these two things don't line up that well. Yeah. It's all about like tricking your audience in a way. Like it's all about showing what you've researched the best in the most casual way. So you can be like, look, don't look at these holes over here where I haven't actually figured out like transit or anything.
Well,
look over here where I figured out like history and monarchy.
Yeah. I was going to say, for me, it's language. But, and I mean, that's like a really ironic thing to say, considering I started this by being like, I grew up not wanting to read things like Tolkien because the language seemed like super, super daunting. But I use language, I look at idioms. I look at turns of phrase and how those are reflections of culture. I look at folklores and specifically the folk stories that a culture within my story will tell. Mm-hmm. So I actually build my worlds from the inside out that way. I don't actually design my characters. My characters are usually outsiders. So before I design my outsiders, I have to design my insiders. And before I design my insiders, I have to design the culture that they are inside. And so the first things that I start out when I'm designing a society or a world is, and like the politics are my weakness. Like I really hate politics. And so that's not the thing I look at. But what I do look at are, what are the stories that people tell their children at night? And what are the turns of phrase that they use? And do they have words for goodbye? You know, what are their specific cultural indicators, and then I use them very, very sparingly. But you'll notice is like over the course as you read my series, you'll pick up the words for hello, the words for blessed, the words for prince, the words for goodbye, the words for very certain things that become weighted. And they become, what's fun is that I have a character who was born in that world and knows that language intimately, and I have a character who has just been dropped in that world and doesn't know that language. And so as she's learning that language, the reader learns those relevant pieces as well. And so I think that for me has been a way to really flesh out a world and make it seem whole.
That's the Sherlock Holmes method, which is actually really good. Give them a dumber sidekick that like everything needs to be explained to. And like, I'm just, Watson in most iterations is not that smart, but you give them this assistant and Holmes has to explain everything to them, and therefore everything's explained to the reader. A lot of fantasy and sci-fi authors use that to like great effect. You're like, new person in this world, someone has to explain everything to them, and that way the reader gets fed it as well.
Or no one does.
Or no one does.
You have to figure it out in what ways are relevant to them.
And I will add that, because I was talking about things making a coherent whole, nobody is going to describe everything in the world, right? No story is going to hit every aspect of that society. So you can elide the ones that aren't really relevant to your story, which are probably the ones that you don't really care about. And then the flip side of that then is, I will say one of the things that for me brings it to life is what I've started thinking of as gratuitous world building, except I don't mean that in the negative sense that you usually think. I started noticing this because of Sarah Manette's Doctrine of Labyrinth series. One of her narrators, Mildmay, loves stories. And so Mildmay's narration is just filled with references to historical figures and like, oh, his friend the actress is putting on such and such of a play, which isn't really his favorite play by this particular playwright. And now, Monette, if you ask her, like, about, oh, what about that historical figure? She will tell you all about them because that's how her brain works. But you don't even need to know the entire story of who was this famous poisoner, who did they kill, why did they do it, what poison did they use, etc. You just mention that when poison comes up in the way that we might say, like, Lucrezia Borgia or something like that. and it makes the world feel real. So it's like you with the folklore, that people think about the number of references we make in our daily lives. I know from Annette, actually, she has a degree in like Renaissance drama. So she was looking at how like Jacobean playwrights would make all these allusions. But think about the number of pop culture allusions we make in daily speech. And then think about the fact that your characters would have their own things that they're going to reference.
I was on a panel 2 days ago with Brennan Sanderson, and he said this too. Is he said that shallow begets deep, right? So you don't actually. So you as the writer have like 10 pages of world building to every one page that ever gets on. So you understand the deep world building. But for your reader, you do the shallow world building, which are these references to larger concepts that you don't actually need to have on page. What you need to have is that insider knowledge for your character that would make an offhand reference the same way we would about Beyonce.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. Do you find yourself, there's some stuff in the Sandman Slim novels, because I have a lot of deep background stuff that can't go in the novel, because it'll just crash the story. Yeah. So my cheat for that is I'm starting to write side stories about single characters. So I have a character named Candy in the stories who isn't human. She's called a Jade, and I wanted to write something scarier than a vampire. She functions similar to a vampire, but the Jades are sort of more spidery, and so they don't drink your blood. They sort of dissolve you on the inside and do that. But there's a whole culture around the Jades, like why they're called Jades, and I've never been able to get it in the books, so Candy's getting her own story.
You hold the backstory.
Just so I can have her with other Jades and have some of that background come out.
Dan Wells wrote an entire, like, all of his backstory for his monster in his serial killer series, in his Dan Cleaver series, and none of it ever made it on the page, but his editor was simply like, figure out your monster. And that material that he wrote for his backstory became the entire inspiration for the second trilogy that is now like halfway through at Tor. It's like, you don't know.
One thing to keep in mind is that we don't know how our world works. We have suspicions. We have alternative theories. You know, you can be a libertarian or a Marxist. You can have different sociological theories, anthropological theories. We don't actually know. So often my issue is because my background is political economy. When I read a fantasy novel, I'm like, no. Clearly, where's the class struggle here? That makes no fucking sense. You know, that kind of thing. So we're not going to satisfy every reader anyway, because they're going to come in with their own contingent suppositions about how worlds actually work. And my own books are all about people trying to figure out how their own world works and failing. My latest novel is a zombie novel called The Last Weekend. They're trying to figure out where the zombies came from. They find a pretty good reason at the end, but the guy's like, wait a minute, that's still full of holes. We don't really understand. And that's sort of the thing that I deal with, like the failures of world building. Yeah.
I was gonna say. Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say. Also, when we talk about like knowing your world, doesn't mean you have to have like a spiral notebook filled with all these details. Often there are things about your world you just know in your head. You're like, well, of course, you're like, that's how it works. Of course, I've never written it down. And after publishing a book, I will never judge George R.R. Martin for forgetting his characters again. Because it is hard to be like, did I mention this character already? Because in my world, in my head, they're intricate, but it's all, you keep it in your head and it's fine. You don't have to write, because often I find if you write like full notebooks, you get distracted with world building and never actually get
it becomes
to
cat waxing.
I'm completely the opposite. I have a Bible for every big project, simply because who did I kill?
Yeah.
In
Is
the
that person
last
still
book,
alive?
what's that guy's? What was the nickname for that one character?
I just wanted to say on the topic of people being wrong about things in the story, one of my huge pet peeves is this monster is attacking us. Well, according to this book, and that book is exactly right. And it tells you everything you need to know about it, and there's never anything wrong in it. I'm like, no, that's...
instructions aren't right.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I much prefer those layers. And I'll bring up the Dragon Age video games again. They've done a really nice job with the information you get fed in the game is coming from people in that world. It is not word of God from the designers. So you learn things, and then later on something comes along and goes, no, actually, that thing you thought was true, that was just what they believed was true. Doesn't mean it's actually right.
So we have got 5 minutes left, so now it's time for comments, not questions.
Wait, she's been waiting.
Oh, you've been waiting for
long.
Okay, then we can't answer it, though. So you can ask a question, but not going to answer it. Okay, so what's the question?
I feel bad. I feel there's a lot of pressure on this question, and really, I'm curious, since you're all fantasy authors. I had the experience of looking for Victoria's book, A Darker Shade of Magic, and couldn't find it. I was frustrated, but I was in the YA section, and it wasn't there. And I'm wondering, I mean, there seems to be such a...
Did you find it in the adult section?
I found it in the sci-fi fantasy section. It didn't even occur to me, though, until the bookseller. Thank God I wasn't in my hometown of Fremont, where we have no bookstores. But do you feel that it's a limitation how much pressure there is to categorize and say it's fantasy, it's high fantasy, it's sci-fi, versus just saying kind of like fiction, nonfiction, or do you like having a box that you sit in and it makes it easier for people?
Is capitalism bad, or are you a sucker? Go on.
I don't mind it. I write for children, I write for teens, I write for adults. If by that you mean I have specific places on bookshelves, I write for my readers. And sometimes my readers are children, sometimes my readers are teens, sometimes my readers are adults. I kind of just count on them to find the book in the end. And I don't care. I don't have any influence over where it goes on a shelf. My allegiance is just to the readership, whatever age they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a balance point, because I think having no boxes at all isn't helpful. Like, I don't want to wade through 12 books on some middle-aged professor having an adulterous affair with his student to find the books that I actually want to read, because that's a trope I just have zero time for. But I mean, I like the fact that we shelve science fiction and fantasy together, because a lot of us read both of them. It would drive me mad if they started to break it up into, here are the epic fantasy shelves, here are the urban fantasy shelves. That would be terrible. But as long as we're not physically putting things in different locations at that final level, it doesn't bother me. I know there are people who use like different pen names for different subgenres of fantasy they write, and I would not personally want to do that, because I don't see a sharp division between the different series that I've written. I want my readership to follow me through them. And I think it does help that as, we do still have the thing in physical bookstores, there is a shelf the book will be on. They probably don't shelve it in multiple places. But we're discovering a lot of things through other methods besides walking down the rows in the bookstore. So when you get to like tagging systems on Goodreads and places like that, then it's not discrete boxes things go into, so it doesn't matter how many labels you put on a thing, right?
I get a little frustrated sometimes, almost the opposite, in which you think there's a lot of rigor in sort of labeling different books and different kinds of books in this, and it's just a mess. And people call my stuff urban fantasy, noir fantasy, and then I get lumped in with horror. And it's like, just fucking choose something, man. Just put me somewhere. And that really annoys the hell out of me. That's the only sort of genre thing, is just how it's made up on the fly all the time, often by a reviewer.
Yeah.
And that gets really tiresome to me.
As someone who works in publishing, I'll tell you there are BISAC numbers for every set of codes, and they're ever increasing numbers, and you get to pick 2 or 3 of them. That then goes to salespeople who don't read, who literally do not read books at all. And they're like, oh, what, is this like Neil Gaiman? I'm like, sure it is. Sure, fuck it, yeah, definitely. It's like Neil Gaiman, absolutely. If you liked Eat, Pray, Love, you're going to love Geek Love. That's what I say to people. And then it goes to the bookstores, and unlike people like Naaman, who works at a good bookstore and reads, a lot of people who work at bookstores may as well be working at CVS. It may as well be Pop-Tart and toilet paper, as far as they're concerned. They don't know what the hell they're doing either. So a lot of these things seem purposeful, but are actually incredibly just a series of accidents. And if you can find anything in a bookstore, you're doing a really good job at all.
Some things come in tagged really oddly, where I'm like, this is in mystery, but it's about a comet hitting the Earth, and the last policeman was tagged like mystery for a long time, and I was like, no, science fiction, and then it finally started to sell. So I think that those boxes are helpful for people finding what they want. They can be unhelpful. I hate a bookstore where I'm shelved on like the black author shelf. There are certain subgenres that are used just to like divide. And I like to mix my genres. There's a book I'm writing that probably won't come out for like 7 years. That's a mashup of Alice in Wonderland and John Carter of Mars. That I call Alice of Mars. It's about a young Asian woman who's taken to Mars because all Alices eventually are taken there. And so like...
Any Alices in the house?
I was like, I don't know how that's gonna... I don't know what genre it would be in when it's done. I don't know who's gonna, but that's the story I want to write. So I do appreciate that science fiction and fantasy aren't separated further in stores, because I'm like, playing with those. And actually, I love YA because I feel like there are less rules in YA. YA, people who like YA for some reason, the only qualification is it has to feature a teenager. And so other than that, you can do whatever you want. And there are some like amazing genre blending YA out there. On the other hand, my book is getting called YA a lot just because both the characters are 18 and I'm like this.
And speaking of your book, we're going to leave now.
Oh,
and we're going to sign books. So you can get a copy of Naaman's book. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.